You know what's fascinating about avoidant types? They don't lose you when the relationship ends. They lose you after the silence sets in, after you've stopped reaching out, after you've stopped trying to get them to open up, stopped explaining your feelings, stopped hoping they'll finally show up emotionally. That's when it hits them, but not in the way you might think. Avoidants, whether they're consciously aware of it or not, run from intimacy because at some deep early level, they learned that closeness equals danger. So in relationships, they keep a certain emotional distance. They can be charming, affectionate even, but there's a ceiling, a glass wall. You're there, but not really in. And while you're in that relationship, feeling the weight of emotional starvation, they're fine, or at least they seem fine. They've built entire identities on not needing others. But here's the twist. That emotional distance they use as a defense also delays their emotional processing. Avoidants don't process loss during the breakup. They process it when there's no longer a threat of vulnerability, when you're gone, emotionally gone. That's when the emotional realization punches through the defenses, and it's not a graceful moment. It's often confusing, destabilizing, and even painful for them. See, during the relationship, they had control. They could control the level of closeness. They could minimize vulnerability. But once you leave, really leave, they're no longer the one calling the shots. The power dynamic flips. They go from emotionally aloof to suddenly haunted by what they avoided, because now there's silence. And silence gives space for truth. And the truth is they lost someone who saw them, someone who tried, someone who stayed. The human mind can only suppress for so long before what's been buried surfaces. In avoidance, that surfacing is delayed, but it comes. Maybe it's triggered by something trivial, a song, a memory, a glance at an old message, but then they feel it. Not just the loss of you, but the echo of all the things they avoided saying, doing, or feeling. And when that hits, it doesn't just hurt, it disorients. Because avoidants pride themselves on not needing, not wanting, not depending, and yet there they are, missing you, replaying conversations, wondering if they misjudged what they had. That internal contradiction, I don't need anyone, versus why can't I stop thinking about this person, creates emotional friction, and friction creates awareness. Now, this isn't the kind of realization that always sparks action. In fact, it often doesn't. It just sits there like a stone in their chest. And that's the philosophical tragedy of avoidance. They build walls to feel safe, but end up trapped inside them. They run from the fire of intimacy only to find themselves freezing in isolation. But for you, the one who walked away, that realization shouldn't be your closure. Their regret doesn't owe you anything. It's not your responsibility to wait around for it, to validate it, or to fix it. Your healing began the moment you stopped fighting for connection with someone who feared it, and their awakening, as late as it may come, is the consequence of your absence. That's the paradox. You had to leave for them to feel what they were never able to access while you were there. This is why walking away isn't weakness. It's clarity, it's strength. And sometimes it's the most loving thing you can do for both of you. Because when the avoidant finally realizes they've lost you, they're not just mourning a relationship. They're being confronted by a version of themselves they can no longer protect with distance or denial. It's a reckoning, not always loud, not always visible, but powerful. And here's what I want you to walk away with. When someone has to lose you to realize your worth, it's not a sign that you weren't valuable. It's proof they weren't ready to receive the love they were given. Let their delayed recognition be their turning point, not your tether. You don't heal by waiting for their realization. You heal by recognizing your own. Let's talk about what happens next after the avoidant realizes they've lost you. And I don't mean the surface level, oh, I guess they're really gone kind of realization. I'm talking about the deep gut level panic that bubbles up underneath that cool, detached exterior. Because here's the truth. Avoidance is never about not feeling. It's about not showing. It's about containment, control, preservation of emotional safety at all costs. And when that control is broken, when you finally pull back, go silent, stop chasing, that emotional safety net vanishes. The panic kicks in. But it doesn't look like what you might expect. Avoidants don't usually cry, beg, or blow up your phone. That would require vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like danger. So instead, the panic shows up in quieter, more subtle ways. They might suddenly watch your social media stories but not reach out. They might text something vague like, hey, just thinking of you. Not because they're ready to reconnect, but because they need to feel some sense of control again. That's the key word here, control. Avoidants rely on it to manage emotional distance. During the relationship, that control was baked into their behavior, how much they disclosed, when they engaged, what parts of themselves they allowed you to see. But now that you're gone, the script is flipped. They can't control whether you're thinking. They can't control whether you'll ever speak to them again, and they hate that. Not because they don't care, but because caring makes them feel helpless. This is where things get psychologically complex. That panic they feel, it's rooted in unresolved attachment trauma. At some point, whether through childhood experiences or early relationships, they learn that needing people leads to disappointment or, worse, rejection. So they built a belief system. If I don't depend on anyone, I can't be hurt. But loss is a funny thing. It bypasses logic. It slips past defenses. It whispers, you cared more than you let on. Now that internal conflict begins. Their mind is saying, I'm fine. I always bounce back. But their body, their nervous system is in fight or flight. They can't sleep. They replay things. They wonder why your absence feels so much heavier than they expected. It's a kind of panic that's existential, not loud, but consuming. Because if they were wrong about how much they needed you, what else have they been wrong about? This is where the philosophical side of avoidance comes in. Avoidant types build identities around independence. They take pride in it. And listen, independence is a good thing until it becomes a mask for fear, until it becomes a prison. So when they lose you and the panic begins to set in, it's not just about losing a person, it's about losing the illusion that they never needed connection in the first place. That realization shatters something, and it doesn't always lead to growth right away. Sometimes it leads to withdrawal, emotional shutdown, or even projection. Because if you were the first person to really see them, that kind of exposure can feel terrifying in hindsight. And maybe, just maybe, that panic is the first crack in the armor. You see, avoidants aren't heartless. They are just practiced in self-protection. But no matter how thick the walls are, grief finds a way in. Regret finds a way in. And when it does, it stirs something. It forces a reckoning with the question, what did I push away because I was afraid to hold it? Let's be honest though, this moment isn't always visible from the outside. You might never see it. They might never admit it, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. Silence doesn't mean peace. In fact, for many avoidants, your silence is what triggers their storm. They're not texting you back because they've figured it out. They're silent because they haven't. They're overwhelmed, conflicted, and fighting a part of themselves they've avoided their entire life. And if you're the one who walked away, If you've had to sit with the pain of loving someone who could never fully show up, this part might be hard to accept. Because maybe you wanted that panic to be motivation. You wanted it to wake them up. You wanted it to mean something. But their panic doesn't mean you go back. It means they go inward. It's not your job to soothe the person who pushed you away. It's not your job to hold space for someone who wouldn't hold space for you. Their emotional reckoning belongs to them. Yours already began the day you chose self-respect over self-abandonment. And that brings me to this reminder. Just because they panic when you leave doesn't mean they were ready when you stayed. Let's go deeper into what happens after that panic starts to simmer, after the avoidant feels the quiet shock of your absence and the emotional armor they've worn so confidently begins to crack. This is where things can get confusing for the person who walked away, because what happens next often looks like connection. It looks like interest. But if you're not paying attention, you'll misread the signs and end up back in the same painful loop. Avoidants, when they realize they've lost someone significant, often try to reassert some kind of control or familiarity, not because they're ready to re-engage emotionally, but because they're trying to regulate their internal chaos. That's the distinction most people miss. It's not about closeness, it's about coping. And they'll do this in very particular ways. It might be a text that says, "Hey, how have you been?" out of nowhere. Or they might respond to a story, react to a photo, or send a song that reminds them of you. These are not random gestures. These are attempts to reestablish a thread to feel connected, even if only superficially, because the loss of you, not just the relationship, but your energy, your presence, your availability, left a vacuum. And that vacuum is uncomfortable, even for someone who built their identity around being fine on their own. But here's where it gets tricky. These reach outs aren't always about you. They're often about them, about soothing the dissonance they now feel. You were once their emotional mirror, whether they acknowledged it or not, and now that mirror is gone. So what do? They try to catch a glimpse, not to rebuild trust, not to grow, but to feel something familiar again. This is why you've got to be honest with yourself when that message comes in, because it will. And when it does, your brain might light up with hope. Hope that maybe they've changed. Maybe the panic woke them up. Maybe they're finally ready to show up differently. But let's pause right there. Hope is beautiful, but it's also dangerous when it's based on potential rather than evidence. Most avoidants, when they reach back out, are doing what psychologists call protest behavior. It's a subtle form of trying to restore a lost connection, but without vulnerability, without full accountability, without the hard work of emotional repair. And often these efforts aren't sustained. They reach out, you respond, and then they retreat again. Why? Because the anxiety is temporarily soothed. They felt reassured that they weren't truly abandoned. So the urgency vanishes and they go back to their default emotional distance. Now, philosophically, what's happening here is fascinating. You've got a person who has spent years avoiding intimacy, now craving contact, not because they've transformed, but because they're afraid, not just of losing you, but of facing themselves. That's what your absence forced them to do. Look inward. And that internal confrontation, it's not easy. It stirs everything they've pushed down, fear of rejection, inadequacy, shame. And rather than sit with those feelings, many avoidants reach outward, not in love, but in self-preservation. So the real question becomes, what do you do when they reach out? Do you open the door again, hoping this time will be different? Or do you stay grounded in the reality of what the relationship was, not just what you wanted it to be? And here's where the deeper truth lives. Unless they have done the internal work, genuinely examined their patterns, confronted the root of their avoidance, and developed the emotional tools to stay, then any attempt to reconnect is likely just a temporary balm for their discomfort, not a commitment to change. You've got to ask yourself, am I being invited into a new chapter or just the same story with a different cover? Because without that clarity, you risk confusing their guilt for growth. You risk mistaking their emotional reactivity for readiness. And you deserve better than that. You deserve consistency, accountability, presence, not a breadcrumb trail of messages sent out of panic or nostalgia. Let's make this plain. Just because someone misses you doesn't mean they're meant for you. Missing someone is a feeling. Showing up differently is a decision. And avoidance can absolutely make that decision, but it has to come from within. Not from fear of losing control, not from the temporary discomfort of being alone. If they truly want to reconnect, it won't be vague. It won't be passive. It won't be rooted in indirect gestures or half-hearted messages. It will come with clarity, ownership, and sustained emotional availability. Anything less is just noise. And you're not obligated to re-enter the chaos just because they finally notice the silence. So remember this. Attention is not the same as intention, and the person who only reaches for you when they feel anxious is not the same person who's ready to hold you when you feel vulnerable. Let their reach out be what it is, a sign that your absence mattered, but let your boundaries be what speaks next. Now, this is the moment where the story can go one of two ways. We've talked about the avoidance delayed realization. We've explored the panic that sets in when they finally grasp what they lost. We've looked at the subtle, often confusing attempts they make to reconnect, not necessarily to rebuild the relationship, but to ease their own discomfort. And now we've arrived at the critical turning point, the fork in the road. Because after the dust settles, after the initial panic fades and they're left alone with the consequences, this is where something real can finally happen. Or not. This is where the avoidant faces a choice: evolve or retreat, confront or avoid, grow up emotionally or double down on their defenses. And what determines the outcome? Not you. That's one of the most painful, liberating truths you'll ever learn. Their growth isn't your responsibility. And your worth is not validated or erased by what they choose to do next. Their next chapter is theirs to write. And if you're smart, you won't stand around holding a pen, hoping they'll invite you back in. Here's what typically happens. When someone with avoidant attachment finally hits that internal wall, when they've lost the person who saw them, who tolerated the push-pull dynamic, who stayed longer than they probably should have, they begin to realize they have two options. Option one, they retreat. They rationalize. They say things like, it wasn't meant to be, or I'm better off alone. They intellectualize the loss because actually feeling it is still too dangerous. So they fold the experience into their narrative, one that protects them from change. See, this is why I don't get close. It always ends badly. They go back to their emotional cave, familiar, safe, and lonely. But option two, that's where something rare and powerful can happen. Some people do stop. Some sit with the pain long enough to recognize the pattern. They don't just miss you. They realize they were unavailable, avoidant, scared, and they don't just say it. They do something about it. They seek help. They read, they listen, they go to therapy. Not just to vent, but to learn. They get uncomfortable. They let someone hold up a mirror. And it hurts, but they stay with it. That's emotional maturity. That's accountability. That's the beginning of transformation. And if you're wondering why this doesn't happen more often, the answer is simple. Change is hard. It's not just behavior, it's identity. An avoidant person who starts doing the work has to question everything they've built their emotional life around. Independence, control, self-sufficiency. They have to dismantle their own ego in order to rebuild from something authentic, something relational. That kind of growth isn't just rare, it's radical. But when it does happen, it's undeniable. You'll know it not by what they say, but by how they show up. No more ambiguity, no more games, no more I'm just checking in texts with no follow through. They're clear, they're grounded, they take ownership of their past behavior without minimizing it or blaming you. They tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable. And most of all, they respect your boundaries whether or not you let them back in. Because here's the truth. Real growth never begs for a second chance. It offers a better version of self, no strings attached. Now, I want to speak to those of you holding out hope that the person who hurt you will one day become this version of themselves. I get it. Hope can be beautiful, but it can also be a trap. Don't wait around for someone's growth to align with your healing. Don't put your life on pause, hoping they'll finally become emotionally fluent. That's not love. That's delay. That's deflection. That's bargaining with reality. Your job is not to stand still waiting for someone else to change. Your job is to move forward. Eyes open, heart intact. If they evolve, they'll catch up. If they don't, you'll be far enough down your path that their absence no longer stings the same way. And maybe, just maybe, their journey through loss, through the collapse of control, through the discomfort of loneliness, maybe that's the exact storm they needed to face. Not because they lost you, but because losing you forced them to meet themselves for the very first time. And that's the quiet irony of this whole dynamic. You walking away might have been the most honest expression of love they ever received. Not because it was gentle, but because it was real. Because it said, I will no longer participate in my own emotional neglect. So here's your takeaway. Their turning point is not your invitation. Let it be a lesson. Let it be a closing. Let it be the beginning of your next chapter. Because someone else's wake-up call should never come at the cost of your peace.